let's see. They tell me that I'm supposed to tell you who I am to start with. My name is Morgan, his first name is Donald, and the middle name is Leroy. I was born in 1920. I was born in my grandmother's house at 220 West 2nd Street in Sandwich, Illinois. And that's where I grew up. Actually, I was 17 years old before I left that house. My mother and my father were divorced when I was 3 months old. My mother and my father decided to move to Aurora, Illinois, which was like some 22 miles distant from where I was born and living. Mother I saw from time to time, maybe once a month, something like that. But my father, never met him until I was 17 years old. So my background is a little two-sided, and probably I'll touch on that as we go along. I was a member of the first class of kids that began their school years in kindergarten. There were no kindergartens when I was born, but after I got to be 5 years old, there was a kindergarten. And that kindergarten was about 6 or 7 blocks from where my grandmother lived, where I was living. And I can recall it to this day. It was so clear and still is clear. I recall walking along the sidewalk, leaving Graham's home, right down that same street, 220 West 2nd Street, to the school. And this school was huge, in my words. I mean, it was big. And I can remember the steps, the wooden steps were real wide as we approached it. And anyway, we went up the steps into the building, and we just made a complete turn to the left, and there was the kindergarten room. There was a sandbox in there. I remember that very vividly. And so I started playing in the sandbox. And there was a bunch of other kids there. And the first thing I knew, I looked up and the grandma's gone. Oh boy. I started, you could have heard me probably for 7 blocks. I was screaming so loud because I didn't want her gone. I wanted her right near me. So I flew out of the school, down the steps, and I headed towards home, and I could see her, maybe 4 or 5 blocks down the street. And she heard me. She turned around and she started walking back towards me, and I caught up with her. Well, needless to say, that was my first day in kindergarten in Sandwich, Illinois, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. The second day, she took me down there, and I was able to forget all that happened, and I enjoyed myself in the sandbox, and then she came down and got me for lunch on the second day. But that's a little story that I've always remembered, and I thought I'd put it on the film. At any rate, having been born in Sandwich, obviously it was just before the Depression, so as a kid, I didn't have very much. So little, in fact, that a quarter was like being, how do I say it, rich. Or if I had 50 cents, it was unbelievable. And so I grew up with very few pieces of candy, very few luxuries. Now I had food. Grandmother had a big garden, and always had enough food to eat. So I have no complaints whatsoever. We didn't have a bathroom in the house. We had a stool, had a toilet stool in the front bedroom, right out by the front of the house. So unless you had the curtain pulled, people could walk by the house on the sidewalk and see you sitting on the stool. But that worked out okay. So for 17 years, I took a sponge bath. I shouldn't say 17 years, because when I started to high school and I started playing basketball, then we had some showers. And I was very, very happy in those showers, and of course, I still am today. but we still had the necessities. The primary necessities, of course, were food. My grandfather, his name was Otto Bergreen, and he came from Sweden. And by the way, my grandmother came from France. So anyway, my grandfather was an iceman. You see, back when I was born, there were no refrigerators. We had what they called ice boxes. An ice box was an item that looked like a refrigerator, except that all it had in it was a compartment, and big 25-pound chunks of ice were delivered to the home, and they were put into the top compartment above the food, and then the cold air, which goes down, would go down and keep the food cooled, so that we didn't lose food that was put into the refrigerator. The only bad part of that was any food that was left over, I could not stand to eat leftovers. It didn't keep it nice enough, so I couldn't stand eating it leftover. That's a little thing about my kid life. So anyway, as I said, my grandfather was an iceman, and as I grew older, I would, my uncle had an uncle named was Speed, Friedel Bergreen. He was my mother's brother, and he would get on the ice wagon once in a while with Granddad, and they'd go out and they'd pedal this ice. Well, they had ice that was in a 100-pound cake of ice, and they had an ice pick that they would punch two lines in it, crisscross, and get two 25-pound, or I should say 4 25-pound cakes of ice out of it. And then they would deliver a 25-pounder to the ice boxes of the various people along the way. But when they were doing this on the ice wagon, and by the way, the first ice wagons that they had were horse-drawn. There was no trucks of anything like that available. It was just horses. Then there would be chips of ice that would fall on the ground, and they would fall on the back end of the little wagon. And so us kids would follow that, and we would find these ice chips, and it was like eating a lollipop. It was just so, especially in the summertime, it was so refreshing. I might tell you a little bit about ice, where it came from. At the west end of Sandwich, there was a stream called the Salmonot Creek, and it had been dammed up so that there was a lot of backwater. And the water got to be 3-4 feet deep behind the dam. And so in the wintertime, when everything froze, the ice would freeze on this still water above the dam, and it would be like 2.5, 3 feet deep. Well, there was a thing called an ice saw. An ice saw is about 6 feet long with a crisscross handle on it. And they would go out on the ice, and they would actually cut the ice like they would a piece of wood in 100-pound chunks, which would float. And then they would pick them up, they would put them on a kind of an elevator item, and it would go up into this ice house which was sitting there, a big old building, and the ice house had a lot of sawdust in it. As a kid, as I grew older, I would go down and help them out a little bit. I got to be pretty good size in my youth. And I can recall seeing those big chunks of ice come into the ice house, and then it would be packed in order, and then there would be sawdust packed all the way around each cake, which would preserve the thing through the summer. Believe it or not, it wouldn't melt very much through the summer. That sawdust would keep it from doing that. When I got to be 5, as I mentioned, I went to kindergarten, and the kids that I went to kindergarten with, as an example, Sandwich, and we ended up going all the way through school, up through and senior, up to a senior.